The Fuchs, a beautiful home in Palo Alto on the campus of Stanford. It is March 18th, 2002. I'm here with Victor Fuchs, and Victor is going to tell us about his times at the National Bureau. So why don't you take it from there, and we'll go in whatever chronological or non-chronological direction you would like.
All right, my first time at the Bureau, I was there as a visitor at the invitation of Saul Fabricant. I believe it was in the spring of 1958. I had a one-semester leave of absence from Columbia University to work on a Social Science Council monograph. My monograph dealt with the location of industry and was eventually published by Yale University Press. I looked at changes in the location of manufacturing in the United States between 1929 and 1954, approximately. And Saul, I guess, knew of me, or it might have been an introduction between George Stigler, who was one of my professors at Columbia, and Saul. And Saul said, you know, we have some extra offices if you'd like to come down and work there. And it sounded good to me for the intellectual stimulation and contacts and so on. And that's how I came to the Bureau as a visitor, and didn't return to the Bureau until 1962 as a staff person when Saul hired me to direct a project on the service industries.
Right. Can you say a bit about the fact that you were a graduate student at Columbia? You began in 1950, is that right?
That's right, 1950.
1950. And you continued at Columbia until, was it 1955?
No, 1958. That year when I was on leave writing this was my last year at Columbia. I started teaching there immediately after completing.
Okay, so it was 1958 is when you left your position as graduate student and you began your position as assistant professor.
No. I was a graduate student from 1950 on.
Right.
I started teaching in 1953.
Okay.
I received my degree in 1955, and I left in 1958.
Okay. And when you left in 58, you went to the Ford Foundation?
No, I went to New York University for 1 year, and then went to the Ford Foundation.
Okay, so you went to Ford in 59.
Right.
Okay. Now I've got it all.
Well, pretty much.
And when you were at Columbia, so you were at Columbia and you got your PhD in a very short period of time. It was pretty fast.
Well, considering that I was teaching full time.
Okay, considering, or I should say that you became an assistant professor very quickly.
Well, until I got the degree, I wasn't called an assistant professor.
Okay.
I was called an instructor.
An instructor. Okay. So from the time you were an instructor until when you got your PhD, you were teaching economic theory?
No. I was teaching undergraduates in the School of General Studies.
Okay.
This was a special program. Most of the courses were in the afternoon and in the evening. Most of the students were older than the typical undergraduate.
And that's where I'm trying.
And
I was trying to figure out when you wrote Warner and Fuchs.
That was
then
during that period of time. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I was going to mention. Well, I like the case method of instruction, even through principles.
Right. And did how much interaction did you have with Arthur when you were a graduate student?
I took one course with him, and that was our main interaction. The second interaction was interesting because it didn't occur. As a graduate student, when you take your oral exams in your courses, you're allowed to choose the professor you want. Who do you want to do, question you on economic history?
Right.
Who do you want in theory and so forth? And I chose Arthur as one of my professors who would question me. And when I came to the orals, unfortunately, Arthur had forgotten about it. And at the last moment, after we had all assembled, J.M. Clark, John Maurice Clark,
Right.
came in and said that Arthur had called him and said that he was terribly sorry, but he had forgotten about the exam, and would he please come in and question me on economic theory. And I had never taken a course with Professor Clark, and I had never even exchanged 3 words with him in
Yeah.
the time that I'd been a graduate student. But he was a perfect gentleman, and he began the questioning by saying, "What would I like to talk about?"
Yes.
So it was no problem.
And so you had very little interaction with Arthur when you were at Columbia,
Except for that one course.
except for that one course, and that one course was, of course, on
Theory,
theory.
on anti-theory.
On anti-theory. Yes.
No, we read Hicks, for example, Value and Capital,
Yes.
and things like that.
And but with Stigler, Stigler taught you
The basic
price theory.
price theory, right?
Right.
That's right.
And that must have been an absolute joy.
Joy?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I suppose when that's.
It was funny. I mean,
yeah, it was
there was
funny.
a lot of humor.
I used to go to any course that George would teach at Chicago. I would go to and just sit back and listen, because it was humorous. It was filled with tidbits of interesting economics.
At what stage in your career?
When I was a graduate student, like my second, third
Yeah,
year.
but remember, this is the first year
First
course.
year, right.
Yes, and it was 1950, 51, and I don't know whether he wasn't. I think George is marvelous. I learned more economics from him than practically anybody, but I think you have to have a certain amount of sophistication, a certain amount of understanding in order to appreciate what he's saying. As an introductory course to economic theory, it was deficient in some respects. It wasn't very complete. George was very selective, wisely, I think, in what he chose, but there were lots of things that most people would get in an introductory course that I knew nothing about.
Yeah, I think his teaching and his humor were perhaps too subtle at times.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And the other thing I remember very distinctly is that he would often come about 10 minutes late to class, and then he would make up for it by leaving about 10 minutes early. But as compared to the alternatives were to take a course with Hart or with Vickery, I still think I made the right choice.
Right. Okay, now we get back to.
Yeah, that's not the Bureau.
Well, it is
in
the
a way,
Bureau
yes,
in
I
the sense that
Right.
one of the interesting aspects about people at the Bureau in the 50s and 60s is that so many of them had been Columbia graduate students,
Right.
and that there was an obvious pipeline
Right.
from Columbia, and it was often Arthur, but sometimes it wasn't Arthur
Right.
that was part of the pipeline.
Right.
And in this case, it wasn't exactly
It was George,
Arthur.
because
It was George.
George was on the committee that was supervising this series of monographs, census monographs sponsored by the Social Science Research Council. So it was George who was the pipeline. George was the connection between the Bureau and Columbia and that monograph.
Now, George comes to you and says, Victor, you want to work on location of industry. What was your first sense of what you wanted to do? What had you been thinking about working on?
Very good question. I'm not You want me to make it up now, or you want me?
Well, you can.
I'm not sure I was thinking about anything.
Right.
I was just sort of, had a wife and 3 kids, and
Right.
just getting along and making my way in the world. And I knew I wanted to do research, but I didn't have that clear a line of. In a way, I was straddling industrial organization and labor. I'll tell you where my thinking was. As a young assistant professor at Columbia, one of the senior professors took me to lunch and said to me, what did I plan to specialize in? And I said to him, I wasn't sure that I was going to specialize in anything. It seemed to me that specializing in economics was already too much specialization. He never spoke to me again the entire time that I was at Columbia.
Right.
But location of industry seemed
fine.
good enough. I liked working with numbers, and this obviously afforded an opportunity to dig into a large data set.
Once again, at Columbia, did you take industrial organization with George?
No, I didn't take industrialization. As a student, my interests were primarily in the direction of Soviet economics, comparative economic systems, international trade, economic development, subjects of that kind. I did not take labor. Woolman was the professor there, and I didn't take industrial organization, although later on I sat in on George's course in industrial organization and got a lot out of it, but I never took it as a graduate.
Right. So, location of industry, and clearly as someone who had an interest in trade, for example, and development, location of industry, some of the same theories would apply. No? You just...
I was more interested in development and so on from the point of view of comparative economic systems.
Right.
The Soviet system,
right.
Other types of systems.
But the theory of trade and location of industry, you didn't see the connection.
A little bit. Remember, I mostly didn't operate at a very deep theoretical level. So
at this point, and we'll get to Gary Becker's influence on you a bit later.
Right.
But another interesting point from other interviews is how many people say of the Bureau, I had a family, and even Milton. And the Bureau said, would you like to work? And I thought, well, extra income for what I'm doing? Well, that's great. And here's yet another example of where the Bureau steps in and helps people and pays them for what perhaps they wanted to do. Or in this case, entices you in a slightly different direction. Okay, so this is the route that you came to the Bureau. So in this early year that you worked on this, where did you labor on this project? Were you physically at the Bureau in '58?
Which project?
Location of industry.
For a period of the semester that I was on leave from Columbia, I was physically at the Bureau.
Right.
Went in there almost every day, had an office, not always the same office. One of the memories I have of the Bureau in those days is that there was a very tyrannical office manager. And I think her name was O'Neill, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And one of the joys of coming in on a Monday morning would be to see your effects in the hall being moved from one office to another because somebody else was going to occupy the office that had been previously assigned to you. And I was probably the lowest person on the totem pole, being just an unpaid visitor. And
right.
so,
but
I always had an office, but I never knew which one it would be.
Right. And do you have any memory of people who were there in that year and people you interacted with?
Yes. Well, I think I remember. You know, memory can be a funny thing. We're talking a long time ago. Zvi Grilicus was there as a postdoctoral fellow, I believe. And the memory I have of him is his poring through farm machinery catalogs. And I said to myself, here is a brilliant econometrician who thinks it's important and worthwhile to dig in and get out the actual details, and the specifications, and the prices of machinery, and so on. So that is a memory that I have from that early visit. Yeah.
Right. Did you talk to anyone? I mean, here you were working on this fairly large project. Where were you to begin? What were you to do if you had a problem? What were the best sources? You were using census data. You were using census and manufacturing data.
Oh, yeah.
And
well, every month I would go down to the Census Bureau in Suitland, Maryland, and I would spend at least half a week down there. And I was a sworn agent of the census, so I had access to material that would have been barred for disclosure reasons. And so I was able to use all that material, and I was able to have a great many of my calculations done within the Bureau so that the data didn't move out within the Census Bureau and so on.
Right.
So that was, I had more interaction with the colleagues at the Census Bureau than I did at the National Bureau.
And those were the more recent data, but for the data for the late 20s, 30s, 40s,
Right.
You could use the published stuff that was in the Columbia
Published
Library.
stuff wasn't good enough because a lot of the stuff, the geographical detail was not published because of disclosure reasons.
Of course, for certain
reveal
industries,
information about
automobiles.
particular industries
Right.
in particular locations. Yeah.
That's right.
So I had access to the
Right.
unpublished material.
No, I've used that material, but not for the reasons that you were using it. And of course, something like automobiles, there are lots of asterisks straight across.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. No, but I had the whole stuff.
Now, who did someone say to you, this is how you do it? How did you figure out I can go to Suitland, Maryland, and get this? Did this come to you?
I think the committee provided a little guidance.
The committee, what committee?
The Social Science Research Council
Okay.
Committee that George was a member of.
Okay.
They provided a little guidance, and the people at the Census Bureau provided a lot of guidance into the data. And as far as what to do with the data, that I sort of made up as I went along.
Right, but exactly where it was, I always imagine, as a historian, you had to think very hard about how to ferret out this information. And
Not how to ferret it out,
Yeah.
but what to do with it after I had it.
That was your problem.
That was the
Right.
hardest part, right?
Right, that was the hard part.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're now back on track in 1958, and that's where we ended. So in 1958, you
A brief
from
visit to
58
the Bureau.
59, and then from 59 you were at NYU for the year as something, right?
59, 58, 59, I guess, yes. I was associate professor at NYU.
Right,
School of Commerce, which had been my undergraduate school.
right.
Right.
Which you went to at night while working during the day for your father, who was
That was after the war.
right
Before
after
the war, I was a day student.
Right. So 46 to 50, you attended NYU in the evening, right?
Just till 47. I got my
Just to
degree
47.
at 47.
Okay.
I got a lot of credit for work done in the during the war.
During the war.
Yeah.
Right. When you learned a tremendous amount in Bowdoin
At Bowdoin.
and
That's right. A lot of
somewhere
math
else.
and physics.
Right.
And at Yale, electrical engineering.
Right. So, and then in 1959, you go to the Ford Foundation. You worked just for 1 year, right?
No, I was full-time for 2 years.
I'm sorry,
and then-
59 to 62.
And then I was half-time for 1 year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now, and what did you do at Ford? You worked in the field of what, development and?
They had a program called Economic Development and Administration, but each program officer was to some extent free to develop his own ideas or her own ideas as as they wanted, and I became interested in a lot of problems having to do with human resources and so on. That was when I first got interested in the health field. I initiated a project on health, education, and welfare.
Right.
I think it was one of the more successful projects. It cost $25,000. It was internally administered. It had I signed up 6 people to work on the project. T.W. Schultz, Kenneth Arrow, Carl Kaysen, Bob Dorfman, Herb Klarman, and Peg Gordon.
It's quite a group.
Dorfman and Kaysen didn't come through, but 4 out of 6 is not bad.
No.
Schultz produced that little volume called The Economic Value of Education, which has been a fantastic success, translated into many languages. Arrow produced the seminal article on health economics, published in the American Economic Review in 1963. It's the most frequently cited single-authored article that Arrow has ever written. And then there were quite credible books by Herb Klarman on the economics of health and Peg Gordon on the economics of welfare. So it was a good project.
It was a good project, and it also appears that it formed many of your ideas that later blossomed in health.
It was educational because, related to that was an assignment that I got from the president of the Ford Foundation, Henry Heald. I think that was his first name. Anyway, he asked me to look into what, if anything, the Ford Foundation should do about health in the health field, because until that point they had not done anything in health. And I spent quite a bit of time looking into that. I hired some marvelous consultants, Walsh McDermott from Cornell Med School, Leona Baumgartner, who had been Commissioner of Health in New York City, Rufus Roram, who was one of the founders of the Blue Cross movement in the United States. So I learned a lot from those people.
Right.
Colin McLeod from the Rockefeller University. And in the end, I concluded that the foundation should stay out of the field of financing biomedical research and medical schools and things like that, but that it should provide support for work in health economics and healthcare administration and that type of things. And we did make one grant that would be of interest to you with your Chicago background, and that is a grant to George Bugbee and Odin Anderson, who were pioneers in developing data on drugs, on the consumption of drugs and so on. And for many years they were supported by the drug industry. And then the drug industry took away their support, and they came to me and they said they had an opportunity to go to the University of Chicago to the School of Business, but they didn't have any money. Right. And so I gave them a grant to get started there at Chicago.
Just one small thing, which is, why did you leave a tenured position at NYU to go to Ford?
I didn't find the students at all challenging or interesting, and I didn't find the intellectual environment contributing to my development and intellectual growth. Marion Chamberlain, who was a friend of mine from Columbia, and Neil Chamberlain had deep Ford connections, and they came to me and they said, this is an opportunity to learn and do things and so on, and I thought they were right, and they were right. I learned a great deal there. I met most of the top economists in the country came through the office one way or another, and so I did learn a lot there.
So it was a fruitful 4 years at Ford.
2.5.
2.5.
2.5.
I keep on getting dates wrong.
Yeah.
When I read, when I tried to put together a vita of yours from the pieces that you sent me, but I couldn't get the exact dates.
Oh, I'll give them to you.
Okay, but now we have them.
Right.
We have them through my many errors on this tape. You see, I told you that when we make these tapes, we make mistakes, but I've made about 20 so far. And, okay, so So some of it was half-time at Ford. What were you doing the other half-time?
I was at the National Bureau.
So,
So after 2 years at Ford,
right,
the National Bureau came to me and said, we would like you to come and join our staff and direct this project in the service industries.
I thought that began in 62, but so it began...
Yes.
Okay.
That's
So
right.
it began in 62 because 59, 60, 61, 62, that's why I counted 4 years at Ford.
2.5.
But it was only 2.5 because
Right.
it must have been the very end of 59.
Right.
And then you began the beginning of 62. I
Right.
get it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now we got it absolutely
Okay.
straight, Victor.
Well,
Okay.
I did well at Ford. One of my other projects, which I'm kind of proud of, it really led to much of the work that we associate with the Poverty Institute at Wisconsin. It started with Jerry Summers and bringing him down to West Virginia and getting him to start to work on the unemployed in West Virginia. You remember that in the early 60s there was a lot of concern about structural unemployment, or maybe you don't. Well, you would remember as a historian, not personally. And that was an interesting project and gave support to the University of Wisconsin. I think it led to the creation of the Journal of Human Resources and so on. So that was a good thing, and enjoyed that. At the end of the 2 years, I had to make a decision. The foundation wanted me to stay on and become a more or less permanent staff person and make my career at the foundation. The Bureau was offering me an opportunity to do research. I liked both kinds of work, and so I decided to try, and I convinced each of them that let's try it on a half-time basis. I'll spend half-time at the Bureau and half-time at the foundation. And at the end of 1 year, the foundation decided that this really didn't work for them. And so then I made my choice to go full-time with the Bureau.
Who was the contact at the Bureau? Who was the person?
Saul Fabricant.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you had first met Saul when?
When I was the visitor.
When you were there as a visitor?
Yeah. Right.
Okay. And Saul came to you and he said, what did he say exactly?
That
As
they
you
were
remember.
looking for somebody to direct this project on the service industries, and would I do it?
And did you look at him and say, services?
No, not at all. This has been
Okay.
an interest of mine. This is something I had worked on when I was
Right.
at the Ford Foundation.
Yeah, but didn't you say, Saul, services is so many things. It's you and me and the janitor and the you.
No, I think I had a clearer view of it than they did at the time. Because I thought about it a lot when I was at the foundation.
And so what was the clear view?
That this whole American economy was
Right.
being transformed from an industrial
Right.
to a post-industrial society. And it was being led by
Right.
the shift in employment, just as the industrial revolution had been led by a shift in employment from agriculture to industry. I'm going to...
Anytime you want to get up, you just get up.
Good.
Do you want
I
me
can
to
see
turn
it
this
at
off?
this pace, Claudia. We're not going to do it in an hour, are we?
No, well, what we've done, I'll turn it off right now. Okay, we're in 1958. You're working on the service sector, and
No, I'm in 1962, and I'm starting a project on the service.
We're working on the service sector,
Right.
and motivated by by the interest in the post-industrial society, and take it in whatever direction you want to.
Well, that was a very, very fruitful time. I was full-time at the National Bureau until 1968. And as I've said in my essay, I considered it to be a long and late postdoctoral experience. I was 38 years old when I came to the Bureau, and I felt that I really had not, by a long shot, completed my education and my training and so forth. The graduate work at Columbia was okay, but it was deficient in many respects. The work at the Ford Foundation was very interesting, and I learned a lot, but it wasn't the kind of learning that you associate with being a good research scholar. And the Bureau afforded that opportunity because there were very good people around, and I mentioned, of course, particularly Gary Becker. He, along with George Stigler, were the two main influences on me from the point of view of intellectual development, theory, economics, and so on. And I also give Gary credit for certain characteristics which I think are valuable if you're going to be a scholar, and that is the willingness to take chances, to be persistent, not to be deterred by some people who are just harping at you and so on. And those were things that I observed about Gary which made an impression on me. And in addition, the content of his ideas and his theories, of course, also.
In many ways, Gary is extremely succinct in his ideas.
He's succinct,
He's
yes.
extremely succinct.
Yes,
Right.
yeah.
So
And he's become a much better writer over the years also.
much better.
Yeah.
Right, I think so too. So from 62
To 68.
to 68, you're
I'm
physically
working
at
there,
your
physically
at the
there,
Bureau.
going in practically every day.
Right.
And
who else, or do you want to say a bit
Jacob
about?
Mintzer. Jacob Mintzer had been a fellow graduate student at Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
Of all the graduate students I knew there, he was the most impressive, the brightest, the most in command of economics and also statistical technique and econometrics and so on. And I continued to see a lot of Jacob at the Bureau.
Can you say anything about life at the Bureau? People like Gary and Jacob had jobs up in Columbia. They came to the Bureau
it was
occasionally.
somewhat monastic. People worked in their own little studies, and a small group would gather together for lunch every day in the conference room. This consisted of going down to the street and going to the grocery store and buying sandwiches, and then coming up into the conference room and talking about the affairs of the day and so on. I remember early on, well, almost from the beginning, being opposed to the Vietnam War personally, and most of the people there had not formed a strong opinion one way or the other, or were actually maybe a little in favor of it. And over time that changed. I think I eventually persuaded, not I, but the events persuaded Arthur Burns that the war was a bad idea, and he tried to persuade Nixon, but not very successfully.
When you would have lunch, would Saul be there?
Yeah.
Would Jeff Moore
Jeff
be
Moore
there?
would be there, yeah.
Would Arthur be there?
Sometimes, yeah.
And what were the interactions with Arthur and the group? Was there a sense that this was just a group of peers and?
Oh yeah. Right. And there was an interesting type of interaction with Arthur, which would occur late in the day. If you were prepared to devote a good deal of the early evening to it, you would go down, either you would take the initiative or Arthur would ask you to come in for a chat, and it would begin late in the afternoon, and he didn't seem to be in any great hurry to go on anywhere
Right.
else. And so you'd sit there, and he was a very, very smart man.
Right.
And he had a terrific range of contacts and understanding and appreciation of how the economy worked and how the world worked and so on. When the decision was made to escalate the Vietnam War, he knew about it, I think, long before the Council of Economic Advisors knew about it, because, Johnson did not keep them posted on what his defense spending plans were. But the contracts were being let to defense contractors all over the country, and Arthur knew that.
Right.
And so he didn't need to have Johnson tell him what was going to happen to the defense budget.
Do you have a sense that everyone got along? That Arthur was a brilliant individual,
Yes.
and people had enormous respect for the mind.
Yes.
And followed him.
Yes.
In many ways. But there are many statements about the fact that Arthur could be very, to put it bluntly, cruel to people. Did
Cruel?
you ever? Yeah.
He was tough, very tough-minded.
Right.
And
Cruel in the sense of speaking his mind without a thought about the fragility of the individual.
yes, that's right. That was not, yes. But on the other hand, he had a side to him which was exposed to me once, which surprised me a little bit, so I'll mention it. He and his wife Helen invited Beverly and me to their home for dinner. They lived in an apartment in Manhattan, and I was very pleased and very flattered to be invited there. We were the only guests, and at the end of the dinner, Helen asked if we would like coffee or tea, and I said that I don't take either coffee or tea. She said, "What do you drink?" I said, "I drink milk," and turned out that she didn't have any milk in the house. Arthur immediately jumped up and he asked Helen for a quarter, because I don't think he carried money around. And he ran down to the basement of the apartment house where there was a vending machine that had milk in it, and he got milk and brought it back up. And that really stuck with me, yes.
Well, obviously. Yeah.
A different side of Arthur than one saw at the Bureau.
I saw him, I met him much later and found him to be the most congenial, bright individual. It's a story I won't get into, but it was Victor said that when I asked him about Arthur, he said, I didn't see much of him. He seemed very nice, but one day he made Ruth Mack cry, and that stuck with Victor. That if anyone could make Ruth Mack cry, that was very bad.
Yeah,
So, did you have anything to do with Ruth? Did you see her?
I saw her a little bit, but not a great deal. Our interests in terms of subject matter and so forth overlapped a little bit.
They did overlap, yes.
I had one chapter in my dissertation on fluctuations, cyclical fluctuations in the fur industry.
Right.
She had done some work on hide and leather and so forth, so we had that in common. Ruth was a fellow at the Bureau in 1930, the same year that Arthur was a fellow. So they go back a long way together.
She goes back a long way.
Right. I'll tell you one Arthur story,
yes.
Which is relevant to my work at the Bureau, and that is about 1965. I had not completed the service industry project yet, but I was thinking about where I would be going next in my research, and I more or less decided that I wanted to pursue certain questions having to do with health economics. And I came to Arthur and told him about my plans, and he tried to discourage me. He tried to persuade me to think about some subjects like business cycles or economic growth, something that would contribute more to my professional advancement. And he didn't see a great deal of future for me growing as an economist to spend a lot of time on something like health economics, which was sort of just a byway, And I respected his opinion, but I must have been somewhat tough-minded myself, because I persisted in that thought for a while. And by chance, I met a man named Quig Newton, who was president of the Commonwealth Foundation in New York. And I told him some of my ideas, and he says, well, why don't you write me a letter? And I sat down and I wrote him about a 5-page letter telling him some of my ideas about health economics as a field and asking for some money. And here my memory is not perfect, and you could check the files and see when the letter went out and so forth. But one day I walked into my office, and it didn't seem very long afterwards, and there was a check on my desk made out to Victor Fuchs for a very substantial amount of money. Again, I don't remember exactly how much money it was, but it was a big check. And when I showed Arthur the check, he withdrew all his objections to my doing work in health economics. He's a realist, and if someone is willing to fund it,
it's worth something.
And the person wanted to do it, do it.
Dick Easterlin and others have said something that's similar, which is that Dick felt that there was, and remember Dick's talking about an earlier period because he's talking around 55, 56, that there was little or no interest in the Bureau in what he called labor population, that nexus.
That's right.
And of course what Dick was working on fit in because it was in the long swings tradition.
Sure.
But this sort of fits in, but you come in when things are changing. How could the Bureau not be interested in labor if Gary's there, if Jacob's there? Do you have anything to say about that issue, that here is a collision of business cycles and this
Right.
new group, and you're of course moving from one to the other?
Well, I never did business cycles.
No, but you were, I should say, the non-labor into the labor, the business cycles, the industrial organization.
That's
right.
correct. I think that it's very clear that Arthur's commitment was to business cycle research and the economic development of the American economy. I don't think he was terribly interested in the world economy, but the American economy. And that meant that if there were free funds available within the Bureau, that was the area that got priority. On the other hand, if people were successful in raising funds on their own, there was no one standing in their way and saying you can't work on this and you have to work on that. So that's the way you have to understand it, as a question partly of where does the money go and who brings the money in. See, there were a lot of researchers who never brought a lot of money in on their own. Those researchers who were capable of raising money on their own didn't find any impediments put in their way to work on what they wanted to work on.
Right.
So that's the way to reconcile them.
But then people like Gary come into the Bureau using Bureau money, but then he comes up with some great ideas and brings money, I assume, into the Bureau later. But his first projects were Bureau funded, and they were human capital.
Well, the project, the conference on investment in human capital in 1962,
right,
you'd say, would be the beginning of that type of thing. But that was part of the conference program. And,
CRIW.
Yeah.
Right.
And also, Gary came with very, very strong recommendations from George Stigler and Milton Friedman, which I don't think Arthur or anybody else were prepared to ignore or discount.
Right.
And after that, once we really got rolling in this whole area of what later was called Center for Economic Analysis of Social Institutions and Human Behavior, or Human Behavior in Social Institutions, now, then there was a big fundraising responsibility there, and that was mostly my responsibility.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have any? I'm going to.
I mean, to raise money
Yeah.
for people like Gary and Jacob is partly a burden, but it's partly a privilege.
Right. I can skip to some down to just a few questions, but I don't want to leave this very important part of your life and part of your work on services. And I was wondering if there was any part of this. I know that you want to be succinct. If there was any part of this important project that you want to say something about in terms of the what it left in the Bureau, what it meant to you, where you see it fitting into the Bureau, what
well, for
the
me,
influences of the Bureau on it, and back and forth.
I can speak more clearly about what it meant to me.
Okay.
One was it left me with an interest in doing work in health economics, which I plan to spend about 3 years on. And whenever I think about my relationship to health economics, I think of Al Pacino in Godfather 3, that every time I think I've escaped it, they keep pulling me back in. This is a field that you don't easily escape from, and my intention was not to become a health economist and spend the rest of my life doing research on health economics, but I have spent a good deal of the rest of my life on that. The other thing out of the service industries was a very strong interest in the role of women and the problems of women in a modern society, and that did lead to work like Women's Quest for Economic Equality, a strong interest in what was happening to the family as this new type of economy was emerging. So it definitely provided a backdrop for a lot of subsequent work. Those several years in the service industries. In terms of the Bureau, I don't know whether it had much impact on subsequent work there, except as it evolved through the work of the center that I was talking about, work on the family. We had programs eventually in the economics of the family, the economics of labor and income distribution, program in law and economics, which was headed by Bill Landis and Dick Posner, a program in health economics, and work in the economics of education. Now, all of that, you might say, came out of Gary's intellectual and theoretical influence and my moving from service industries into those kinds of areas.
Right.
And that has stayed they have stayed very strong programs in the Bureau. And
expanded.
Up in Cambridge and so forth.
Very much so.
In fact, there are people in Cambridge who think that health economics started there.
Right, and they don't know.
No.
Yeah, they don't know. But that's why we're doing this, so that we can tell them. Do you feel that in the years that you were physically at the Bureau from 62 to 68, that you influenced any of the young people walking through the Bureau?
I think maybe if I were to pick out a few people of the younger people, I would mention first of all people like Mike Grossman, who took over for me for the health economics program, and who also took my position as professor at CUNY when I left there. I would mention Bob Michael, who was my deputy throughout this period that we're talking about now, and then who went to the University of Chicago, and a very, very successful research administrator, heading up NORC, heading up the School for Public Policy. I didn't used to dispense a lot of advice, but I remember one little piece of advice I gave to Bob when he was deputy to me and clearly headed for career. First of all, I pointed out that there were very few people who were good at administering research, so that if you were good at it, you had the whole world open to you. And as a method of operation, I suggested to him to be honest. I said, it will so amaze people that you will make a fantastic... And he looked at me open-eyed. He said, what do you mean? I said, you'll find out.
I think you're absolutely right.
Just be honest, and you'll stand out in the crowd. And so there was Bob, and there was Michael, there was Bob Willis, there was Lee Lillard, who unfortunately died recently. There were Warren Sanderson, who was one of the younger people in our group.
Right.
Whether I had any influence on Bill Landis or not, it's hard to say. You'd have to ask Bill that.
The piece that I didn't get to read, which is some economic aspects of mortality in America.
That was never published. I never submitted that for publish. I did that for my own education. I understood that there was a lot of interesting data out there on mortality, and I knew that there were a lot of other kinds of data that I knew about, like education and income and so forth. And the epidemiologists who worked in this field never either thought of or never had the temerity to try to put these numbers together. And that's what I did. I said, well, here there are all these numbers out here on mortality and education and income. Let's try to put them together and see what kind of story they add up to. And I presented this work a few times to epidemiologists and so forth, and they were horrified. They thought that being a good researcher meant refining the data, making the data better and more accurate, and the idea of drawing some obvious inferences from relationships between different pieces of data was not something that they did. And so I circulated that to a few people, and it had an enormous impact. In fact, it's an interesting lesson that if you really want to get attention, don't publish. Because I actually had people show up at my door of my house in Roslyn, knocking on the door, asking for a copy of this
underground classic.
Yes, underground classic, and but it did stimulate subsequent work. In fact, it led to 3 research assistants, Richard Oust, Deborah Sarachek, and Irving Levison, did a paper called An Exploratory Study of Production Function, the Production of Health. This was interesting too, because I was going abroad for the summer, and they said, did they have my permission? They had this idea to do a 2-stage model and so forth. They have my permission to work on this during the summer? And I said, by all means. And 3 years later, they finished the paper and they published it in the Journal of Human Resources.
And to this day, the identification of the impact of income and education on health, morbidity, mortality is still an issue that we try to crack that.
Oh, absolutely.
The identification issue is
and my own thinking on it, has changed enormously.
Yes?
Yeah. I used to think that the correlation between education and health was another example of the formation of human capital and the production function approach, that education makes you a more efficient producer of health. Several years ago, I did some research on smoking and education and so forth, which led me to think that that's probably not the main way to think about it. Not to throw it out entirely,
right.
But that the correlation between education and health is really much more a third variable problem, which drives there.
I think in that case, I think you're absolutely right. In some other cases, it may be that you can. The question is whether you can have a treatment effect, whether you can increase education and increase health.
Yeah.
And for some things, in less developed countries, where parents don't know how to rehydrate their
Oh,
children.
yes. I'm talking strictly U.S.
Right.
Modern times.
Right.
Oh, no. And as a matter of fact, if you talk about the low-income countries, it's not education in general, but education of women and specifics that can make a tremendous difference on the health of the population.
Let me get back to the Bureau, and I really just have one other question, two other questions. We're going to run out of time soon, so I'm going to put in another in 5 minutes. We're going to run out of time. I'll put in another tape, and we can do just the last 10 or 15 minutes, and then we will have somewhat completed this. I'm sure that someone will come back and look at this tape and say, "Why didn't you ask Vic this question?" I'm going to go out there and ask him this question. And so the question is very Bureau specific. It has to do with author and the transition. And it may be that you'll say, I really didn't know much about it, but maybe you did. And so when Services was published in '68, Burns was no longer president. John Meyer was president. He
That's
became
right.
President
1968 was the year when Meyer
the
came
transition.
in. That's right. That's right.
And author, some people say fortuitously, became head of the Federal Reserve Board, became chairman of the Fed. Others say that that there was dissension, and so there's sort of push-pull issues concerning author at the Bureau and the transition to John. Can you say anything about the transition? And it's complicated, and your view of it may be different from someone else's view.
To the best of my recollection, Arthur's interest had moved in somewhat other directions than simply running the National Bureau. You have to understand about Arthur that until the age of 40, he was, in his own words, a recluse. He stayed in his office the way Anna Schwartz would stay in her office, and he would do his work. He was not out front. And after the age of 40, he began to develop a very different style, a very different personality. He became very good at relating to all manners of people, business people, politicians. He was a very, very successful chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. He really restored that. So I think that, and remember, when he spent 4 years in Washington, he came back and he said to me, and I'm sure he said it to other people too, that 4 years in Washington, completely withdrawn from academic life, completely withdrawn from research and so forth, essentially finishes you off as a serious researcher. And so he saw his life moving in other directions. And I don't think Arthur's the only one. I think most people who would spend 4 years in Washington would not return to a life in academia. Larry Summers is, he returned to academia, but not as a researcher and a professor of economics, right?
It's a whole different issue, yeah.
And the reasons for that could be because you, on the production side, you lose the ability and the skill to be at the top of your game in that after you're out of it for 4 years. Or it could be on the preference side.
I think it's, with Larry Summers, I think it's on the preference side.
Yes, because he's still very young coming back. But it's on the preference side. You see that you really want to do other things, right? Okay. Yeah, I agree with you that Larry could get back into the game. Yeah. Okay. So Arthur didn't really want to do that. He would have been happy if, let's say, Jeff Moore had assumed the mantle and had run the Bureau the way Arthur had in previous times, but that was not to be. There was not, it wasn't so much that there was a lack of support for Jeff within the Bureau as outside the Bureau particularly foundations and things like that, did not see, I think, Jeff in the same way that they saw Arthur. And so I think that's what led to the bringing in of someone from the outside.
Let's stop here and we'll pick it up for
Very
just a
good.
back with Victor Fuchs. And so
anyway, I think Arthur did not particularly want to continue to run the Bureau. So that was not an issue. And John Meyer was recommended to him, I believe, by Gottfried Haberle, and obviously made a big impression, as he does on almost everyone he meets, because he's so smart and so forceful and so dynamic. And he was brought in. He was particularly good, I think, at getting money from government. That's when he started to raise money, that's where he mostly went. Arthur had been very good at raising money from business people. When the Bureau was running short of cash, I've actually seen this, been in the office, Arthur would pick up the phone and call the head of a major U.S. corporation and speak to him in very personal, friendly terms and tell him what his situation was and that he needed some money, and would he send some and get some of his friends to send some, and they did. And they did support the Bureau. I personally always found private foundations the easiest place to work with to get money, least demanding in terms of what you have to submit and so forth. But that may be partly because I spent a couple of years at the Ford Foundation, so I know how foundations work. And I never felt that they were doing me a favor by supporting me. I felt that if I had a good piece of work, that I was doing them a favor by helping them to spend their money in a reasonably constructive way. So that's just different ways of approaching things. But John was, I think, very good influence on the Bureau for the first 5 years. He was there for 10 years altogether. And in the beginning, he brought a lot of fresh air into it, brought in computers and that type of thing, and different type of research style, more econometrics and things like that. And so it was good. The particular projects that he chose to back in a large way were not very successful. And I think that was part of the problem. He put a lot of chips on 3 or 4 different projects, none of which really hit a home run or even a triple or even a double, and some of which led to very large deficits. And the second 5 years were more difficult for John, partly because of the deficits and partly for other reasons that I don't know, that things just got out of hand under his leadership. And so after 10 years, there was the transition to Marty. And Marty came in to a difficult set of problems also, but has been enormously successful in...
Marty reinvented the Bureau.
Yes, that's right.
Completely.
Changed not only the product, but almost the whole configuration of what the industry was all about.
Right.
Right.
And then the Bureau almost lost its history, and that's what we're regaining right now.
I see, yeah.
When was the Bureau West founded?
This was one of John's ideas, that there should be many bureaus. At one time he had 5 bureau offices, right? And one of them was the idea to have a West Coast presence. And he talked to some people at Stanford who were very enthusiastic about the idea. Stanford found an anonymous donor who was willing to put up the money to build a building. And I don't know if you've seen the Bureau building. That building was built for $250,000, and there was money left over for some of the furniture as well. And so John wanted initially to get Hal Larry to come out and head up the West Coast office.
And so what year are we talking now?
We're talking about the early 1970s.
So you're
this
here.
No, I'm not here.
In the early
Early
70s.
1970s, I'm at CUNY and Mount Sinai School of Medicine and part-time at the Bureau.
But 72, 73.
I come
you
here, but
come
that's
here.
that's purely coincidental. I come
Okay.
here on sabbatical leave or some kind of leave to the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences with no intention of
Right.
moving to the
Okay.
West Coast.
Right.
In fact, by that time, John had been after me to agree to head up the West Coast office, and I had said no. And when we came out here for the year, people said, "Oh, you're going to like California. You're going to want to stay there." And I said the probability of our staying is 0.1. I'm a realist. I don't think it's 0, but it's 0.1. And every month that we were here, it went up by 0.1. So by January, we were sitting out there on the patio in our shirt sleeves, having come back from a walk on the hills, and we're looking at each other, Beverly and I, and we're saying, why are we fighting this? And so I agreed to come, but with a year's grace. I wanted to go back for a year, finish things up personally, research-wise, bureau-wise, and so forth. And then we came in 74. 74, right. And I also did not want to take responsibility for all the fields that the Bureau would be working in. So a co-directorship was worked out with Sherman Maisel, who was a Berkeley professor, who was interested in finance, interested in macroeconomics, and subjects of that kind.
Right.
Yeah.
And but you then became Bureau West,
Yes.
and you were half of the directorship.
Yes,
of
that's right.
Bureau West.
That's right. And in many respects, it didn't realize the hopes that John had for it. One of the hopes was that we could tap into new sources of funding out here that weren't being tapped into through the East Coast operation. And either because Maisel and I were not very successful or for other reasons, that didn't materialize. There was also the expectation that economists all up and down the West Coast would flock here to do their work the way people from Columbia and NYU and Penn would come to New York, but that didn't happen either. And Maisel, I think, gave up the ghost about 1977 or so, and in 1978 I decided I'd had enough of directing. I've been doing it for 10 years, and so I said I want out as vice president and director. And
the projects that John began that, as you said, just didn't pan out. They were very costly. You said that there were 5 projects, some of which didn't pan out in New York, or he had moved part of the Bureau to New Haven.
yes.
Can you do you recall any one of them that was an expensive project that was just poor judgment or just didn't pan out?
Yeah, there were a few. There was a project that Ann Krieger had on, 10 volumes, 10 countries,
Right.
So forth. That was a very, very expensive project. A lot of money, huge amount of Hal Larry's time. He had to work practically full-time on those manuscripts and so on, and they published them and at great cost, and that was not, I don't think, a very successful project. There was a project involving Richard and Nancy Ruggles
Right.
that went on, and I don't know whether there was any product that came out of that eventually. John was very enthusiastic about work on urban problems, and I don't think that was very successful, but
Which is
used
sort
up
of
a lot of the
curious.
free resources of the Bureau.
It's curious because one would have thought that there was a lot of U.S. government money in urban issues and transport and housing and poverty at that time, an enormous amount.
There probably was government funding, but so I don't know that it was a shortage of money. I think the field had fallen on hard times. It was actually a field that I had worked in a bit earlier. I had a fling there for about 2 or 3 years where I worked on regional problems stemming out of my work on location of industry. And I think that field really ran into a dead end theoretically, and it just didn't revive until more recently. Now, of course, there's a lot of interest and a lot of good work being done on urban problems. Well, it isn't as if the urban problems weren't there then as well, but people didn't have a good idea about how to work on them.
Right.
And
right.
So that was not a successful project either. Then John had an idea that the Bureau would become the place, the location of a huge computer. It would be something like SLAC in physics, and that economists all over the country would think about problems that they wanted to work out, and then they would send them or come to the Bureau and have this huge computer grind out the answers for them. He was thinking of a model like the huge physics laboratories. Of course, technology went in an entirely different direction, and so that didn't materialize.
One small point, we just
Yes.
have a small amount of time left, that in services you acknowledge help from IBM, and I was talking to Dick about this as well, and
Oh, that's
that
very
was
simple.
somewhat
The
early
IBM
that
was
had-
free computer
Right,
time.
and they were on 59th Street.
Yes, that's right. And
But did you do it? Did you walk up to 59th Street and submit the jobs? Did someone else submit them?
no,
You did it.
Yeah, I don't know that I personally walked up there. I usually like to give my research assistants as much opportunity as possible
do that.
to do things.
It was a woman named Charlotte Beauchamp.
Yes,
who
she
did
was
the-
very good, very helpful.
Was she the person who took the computer jobs up there?
I don't know whether she physically did, but
Yeah.
she was a very valuable person. And we should mention some of the other people at the Bureau
Okay.
who were very valuable. There was a man named H. Irving Foreman,
Well,
fantastic person.
I'm a great fan of Irving's, and I talked to Dick about Irving as
Yes,
well,
yeah.
because Dick has his undergraduate degree in engineering,
Okay.
but Dick was a terrible draftsman, and of course Irving was the perfect draftsman for an economist. So you might want to say some words about Irving's artistry and his mathematical brilliance as well.
No, that's not what I want to emphasize.
Yes.
Irving had been a research assistant,
Yes.
and he had drawn graphs, I think, for Simon Kuznets. And he was so good at it that it was decided that he would draw them for other people as well. And the thing that I most valued in Irving was his meticulous approach to things, his insistence on accuracy and clarity. So I used to send my research assistants to Irving with a figure that they thought they wanted to have drawn, and he would bombard them with questions and nitpicking about this and that. And I did this because I wanted them to see what it meant to pay a lot of strict attention to exactly what you were doing in this figure and why you were doing it that way and so on. So that's the thing that I most valued, not his skill. His skill was there, and it's there for everybody to see. But the idea that this should be clear and it should be accurate is what I value.
His brilliance in setting up a figure so that you could make comparisons very clear, so that
That's right.
he, rather than as many people do, you put a figure on each page, then you have to flip back and forth. He would do it so that all, and a monetary history, which has, I don't know how many, 50, 60 figures, but within each figure there are maybe 6 figures.
Yes. Yes.
But it's done so that you can make
But
the
that you can-
comparison.
That's right. That's right.
And that was the brilliance.
Yes.
That's what I meant by artistry is that type
that
of
type
artistry.
of artistry. Okay.
Okay.
Not the business cycle shading
No.
and the not shading.
Well, that was good
That was
too.
that was very
that
imaginative.
Was good.
Yes,
That was good.
That was good too. And I don't discount that, but I wanted to throw in this other side too.
And I like the way you put it, and I wish I could speak with Irving Foreman because I have been a fan of his for a long
Okay,
time. And when
yeah,
I open up a bureau book, I immediately look at the figures.
It can be very annoying and frustrating at the time because you think you're finished and you think you know what you want to do, and you're just at the beginning when you start with Irving. Now, Charlotte Beauchamp was very valuable at the Bureau because she was an interface between sort of just the straight research and computers and punch cards and that kind of thing. Now, whether she played any role in my getting some free computer time from IBM or not, I don't remember. I don't remember how that came about, but
You said, were there other people you
Sophie
wanted to mention?
Sakowitz. Sophie Sakowitz had, among other things, the responsibility for looking at every table of every Bureau publication
Yes.
and checking it for internal consistency. You know, you can pick out a lot of possible errors in tables without ever having made the calculations yourself, by just looking at the different numbers within a single table or comparing the numbers in one table with the numbers in another table. And that was her responsibility. She did that very well. I think that was an enormously useful thing to do because people do make mistakes all along the line
That's right.
in calculations, and so that was another kind of thing. And the other thing I would mention is the esprit among the research assistants and the ability to train the new ones as they came in. It was one of the greatest sources of personal satisfaction to me would be to hire a newly minted bachelor's degree person. Very often they were women. Very often they came from the Women's College at the University of Pennsylvania, which had a separate existence at that
That's
time.
right.
And they produced some very good people. And they would come in and they would be nervous and they would be inexperienced and pulling on their hair and wondering about how they're going to do this and that and the other thing. A year later, watch them operate with the new with the new one that's coming in, self-assured, knowledgeable, training the new one, showing them exactly how to do this and that and the other thing, and that just went on year after year after year.
Did any of them go on to graduate work in economics?
Oh yes, quite a
Anyone
few
in
of them.
particular?
Linda Edwards.
Linda Edwards.
Is an example.
Linda-
Well, there were many
Linda
others.
Nassif at the time, right?
I'm not sure, but maybe June might have been a research assistant there. Arlene Leibowitz,
Arlene?
a research assistant there.
Right.
Yes, there were quite a few, and some didn't, but they still did very good work when they were research assistants.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Dick said when we were talking about the IBM on 59th Street, and of course he used it somewhat before you did. He said that he would give the job to Charlotte, who was younger at the time.
Uh-huh.
She would take the job up there, and then about 4 months later, he'd come to his office and it'd be a big pile of output, and he'd look at it and he'd say, "What's that?" And by then he had already, what he wanted to do, he sort of did back of the envelope calculations, he did it by hand, and he had no idea what this stuff was. So it wasn't as useful. He needed much better turnaround. So I think that we've completed just about everything. There's always more. And I know that you want to do your exercises. And
Right.
well, one other person, Chris Nagorski. Do you remember
Yes,
Chris?
yes, wonderful person. very valuable. Bob Lipsy can give you chapter and verse about
Well, Chris is still there.
Yes, she is. I
Right.
saw her last time I visited.
But she is the longest running continuous employee at the Bureau, other than, I think, Anna
Or Bob.
and
Bob.
or Bob.
I don't know whether
Yeah,
Bob
or
was
Bob.
continuous, but
Yeah,
I think he goes back to 47.
he goes back to
And he
47.
probably hired
That's
Chris.
right. Right.
Bob used to hire, or at least interview and test all the candidates for RA jobs. He had a little paper and pencil test.
So Chris began as an RA?
Oh, yeah.
I see.
Oh, yeah.
That I didn't know.
Yeah, right.
Well, thank you very much.
And I
Do you
knew it was
have-
Chris
yeah,
Mortensen, in case people
I see.
get confused about the name.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have
Okay,
any?
does that take?
Well, yes, you've
Well,
said.
the Bureau to me was and is a great place, and I hope that it continues to flourish.
Right.
I recognize that it has to change. I don't think that we touched, and I understand why, because I had no personal contact with him, with Wesley Mitchell, who was, after all, the guiding star for the Bureau for 25 years. And it would be a
Right.
shame if you don't pick up some stuff about
Well, I think
Mitchell.
for Mitchell, it may have to be the written record, his
Yeah.
record, and other people other than Milton. But my sense is that Milton will speak more about Arthur than about Mitchell.
Well, George Stigler has a few pages in some of his autobiographical material about what does it take to create an environment, a productive environment, and some of that deals with the National Bureau, some of it deals with the University of Chicago. So
Right.
you can get some stuff out of that, and I think you can get some stuff out of that volume that I showed you this morning.
Right. And Columbia has this oral history project.
Right.
And I think that there are tapes, because that goes way back, at least into the 80s. So there were people who knew Mitchell who were interviewed.
If you want to interview someone who knew Mitchell very well and who had a lot of opportunities to observe the Bureau, but from the outside,
Right.
I would highly recommend that you go see Eli Ginsberg.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Eli is someone who is on my list, and,
Right.
and I want to talk to him anyhow because he kindly sent me his book on college women,
Oh.
and it's something that I've been working on
Okay.
On and off
Yeah.
for some time.
Right.
Well, I think that one of the nicest things you said about your time at the Bureau was that it was a late and extended postdoctoral experience because that means that you were able to sit back and think, and at the same time you were able to learn. That's why I think the word postdoctoral experience, that's my interpretation of it.
And you have models around,
That's
and you're
right.
working yourself. After all, I was, in charge of a big project, but I was still learning a lot, and there were a lot of people there
Right.
who you could learn from,
Okay, well, thank you very much.
including the
And-
research assistants.
And I think the nice thing about our lives, and I think you would agree, Vic, is that we are always having a postdoctoral experience.
Right.
I'm going to turn this off now.
Although, turn it
What?
off. Okay.